Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and it's good to see you all here today. The In recent weeks, we've been discussing this Tenso Kyokan of Dogen Zenji, the 13th century Zen teacher. Instructions for the cook. And this was the first book of Uchiyama Roshi's works. Uchiyama wrote a commentary on this work, and this is the first book that Tom Wright translated. And then Tom Wright subsequently has translated many of Uchiyama's writings. The text, Dogen's text itself, is relatively short and long enough, though, to spend some time with it and explore the different concepts and stories that Dogen has to tell in the course of giving instructions to the cook. And last week we talked about Monk Lu, a story about him drying mushrooms out in the sun at an older age, which surprised Dogen. And there's one other story about a monk in this text, which we'll talk about today. And that's the monk from Ayuang, from Mount Ayuang. Now, Dogen, when he came to China at the age of, I believe, approximately 23, had to traverse the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, which at that time took about 3 to 4 weeks. And oftentimes there were storms. It was not an easy journey. But he arrived at the port of Ningbo in China, which is on the east coast, a port on the East China Sea, somewhat south of Shanghai. And he was anxious to get off the ship, obviously, after being on it for several weeks, but he was also very anxious to go about his business of trying to find out how Buddhism was practiced in China. At that time, China was considered the cultural center of that part of the world, whereas Japan was considered a somewhat primitive country in comparison. So much of the culture of Japan at that time was imported. It wasn't simply imported, it was transformed into something uniquely Japanese, but they took ideas and images and concepts from China, and he wanted to go to the source. But he was detained on the ship because of some problem with his papers. There was some bureaucratic issue that kept him several days on the ship waiting to be processed. And while he was waiting, a monk came on the ship in the afternoon, and this was the monk from Ayuang. Now, Ayuang is a Mount Ayuang is not far from Ningbo. It's to the south, and there is a temple there, Ayuang Temple, which is still there today. And the port of Ningbo is still there today. Ayuang is the Chinese for King Ashoka. It's the Chinese rendition of King Ashoka. And King Ashoka was a ruler in India around 200 BC or thereabouts, who is very much a part of Indian heritage to this day. In fact, the emblem of India to this day shows a basically four lions looking out in four directions, symbolizing certain virtues. And that emblem was taken from a statue constructed during King Ashoka's reign. King Ashoka was king of well, it was a kingdom in the central part of India that he inherited from his family. And he, being ambitious, invaded a kingdom to the west, or maybe it was to the east, and conquered it in a very bloody war. But at some point, upon witnessing the consequences of that war and the devastation that had been wreaked on the people he had conquered, he underwent a transformation. And at about that time, he became acquainted with Buddhism. And during the remainder of his reign, he was peace-loving and preached tolerance and compassion to those in his kingdom. A very popular king after his conversion. If somebody is not muted, if they could please mute themselves, because it would take me a moment to do that. Anyway, this temple was named after King Ashoka of India. And the monk from Mount Ayuang Temple had come all the way to the port in order to get some mushrooms for a special holiday. And I'll just read a section at this point. And this is the monk talking. He says, "I am originally from Jishu. Although I left there over 40 years ago, I am 61 this year and have practiced in several Zen monasteries in this country. Last year, while living in Guyun, I visited the monastery on Mount Ayuang. Though I spent my time there totally confused as to what I was doing," he said. "Then, after the summer practice period last year, I was appointed Tenzo. Tomorrow is May 5th, but I have nothing special to offer the monks. I wanted to prepare a noodle soup, but I did not have any mushrooms to put in it. I came here to buy some." May 5th is, well, it's on the lunar calendar. It's the 5th day of the 5th lunar month. And traditionally, it is celebrated as a change of seasons, the start of summer in China. And they have celebrations associated with that. It happens to be Cinco de Mayo, but that's not what he's talking about. So going on, Dogen asks, when did you leave Ayuang? And the monk replied, "After lunch." "Is it far from here?" "About 14 miles. "And when will you go back to the temple?" "I'm planning to return as soon as I've bought the mushrooms." And Dogen at this point is so intrigued and so pleased to actually meet a monastic from China. It's his first opportunity to do so. And Dogen says, "You can't imagine how fortunate I feel that we are able to meet unexpectedly like this. If it's possible, I wish you would stay a while longer and allow me to offer you something more, perhaps some tea or something of this sort." But the monk from Iowan responds, "I am sorry, but this is impossible just now. If I am not there tomorrow to prepare the meal, it will not be made well." Keeping in mind that he's got a 14-mile trek ahead of him and it's late afternoon. But surely, Dogen says, there must be others in a place as large as Iowan who are capable of preparing the meals. They will not be that inconvenienced if you are not there, will they? The monk replies, "I have been put in charge of this work in my old age. It is, so to speak, the practice of an old man. How can I entrust all that work to others? Moreover, when I left the temple, I did not ask for permission to stay out overnight." "But why, when you are so old, do you do the hard work of a tenzo? Why do you not spend your time practicing zazen or working on koans or former teachers, the teachings of former teachers? Is there something special to be gained from working particularly as a tenzo?" The monk burst out laughing and remarked, "My good friend from abroad, you do not yet understand what practice is all about, nor do you know the meaning of characters." Characters here stands for like characters and letters, the written teachings, the scriptures. When I heard this old monk's words, I was taken aback and felt greatly ashamed. So I asked him, "What are characters and what is practice?" And he replied, "If you do not deceive yourself in answering these questions, you will be a man of the way." At this time, I was unable to grasp the meaning of his words. So these questions, it's of interest that Dogen again is amazed that somebody of, sort of an elderly person is doing the hard work in the monastery, which was not the practice in Japan. So he remarks upon his age and the work of a tenzo. But to Dogen's surprise and um, embarrassment, the monk says, "You really don't understand what you're doing, and you don't understand the scriptures or the meaning of them." So at that time, the monk from Iowan left and went back to his temple. But in about 3 months' time, it was time for him to end his tenure as a tenzo. And he remembered the encounter with Dogen and knew that Dogen was staying in a monastery not too far away on Mount Tiantong. And one day the Tenzo came to see Dogen. And he said, "As the summer practice period has ended, I shall be retiring as Tenzo and plan to return home. I heard you were here and wanted very much to talk with you and see how you were doing." So they exchanged pleasantries, and then Dogen came back to the core of the matter and asked him, "Well, what is practice? What are characters?" He says, "A person who studies characters must know just what characters are. And one intending to practice the way must understand what practice is. I ask him once again, well, what are characters? He replied, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what is practice? He replied, there is nothing in the world that is hidden. There is nothing in the world that is hidden. Although we talked about many things, Dogen goes on, I will not mention them here. Whatever little bit I have learned about characters and practice is largely due to that Tenzo. When I met again with my teacher, Myozen, who later died in China, and told him of my meeting with the Tenzo from Mount Ayuan, he was extremely happy to hear about it. So later on, Dogen comes across a gatha, or a poem, by Zhuidu. And Zhuidu was a poet, lived about the 11th century in China, quite well known. And the poem goes like this. 1735. The truth you seek cannot be grasped. As night advances, a bright moon illuminates the ocean. The dragon's jewels in every wave. Looking for the moon, it is here. In this wave, in the next. 1735. The truth you seek cannot be grasped. As night advances, a bright moon illuminates the ocean. The dragon's jewels in every wave. Looking for the moon, it is here, in this wave, and in the next. Dogen concludes, it dawned on me then that what the Tenzo I had met the previous year had said coincided perfectly with Jadot's poem. And I realized more than ever that the Tenzo was a man fully living out the Buddha Dharma. So there's no further explanation in this text for what may seem like a very odd response to Dogen's queries about what are characters and what is practice. What are characters? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But in Tom Wright's footnotes and in Uchiyama's commentary, the interpretation of that is everything. You can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the start of an endless series. It's the start of an infinite series of numerals. So it's a stand-in for everything. There's a tradition, I mean, poetry is highly regarded in China and in Japan. And there's a tradition of speaking in poetic language. And we're perhaps not as used to that, but that's what they do or did. So what are characters? Characters, what are the teachings? They're found everywhere. And what is practice? There is nothing in the world that is hidden. And again, that can be interpreted in many ways, but one way of interpreting it is that practice is right in front of you. Whatever is in front of you is your practice. That's it. So I think during one of our previous sessions, Someone during discussion commented that really Zen is very simple. And in some ways, it is very simple and it is capsulized in this interchange that all of this abundant literature is a way of pointing out the Dharma in everything and allowing us to see it, allowing us to be aware of it. And practice is none other than taking care of what you see, what's in front of you. So in some ways, Zen practice is very simple. Maintaining that awareness and actually taking care of what's in front of you can be challenging because of all of the potential for distraction, all of the things that get in the way. I think one message from the monk is that the teachings, especially the written teachings, the spoken teachings, are not so much informative as transformative. The purpose of them is to allow you to see things differently, to adopt a different perspective. And if they are taken as simply informative, one gets into all kinds of circles. The uh, the image of a dragon is very old in China, going back, as far as I think 5,000 years BC. There were indications that a dragon was considered a symbol in China. So it's all very pre-Buddhism in China. And oftentimes dragons are depicted as living at the bottom of the sea and being guardians of wisdom and knowledge. And sometimes that wisdom is characterized as a pearl, sometimes a black pearl, at the bottom of the sea, guarded by the dragon. And that symbolism suggests to me that deep in one's consciousness, deep in one's awareness, there is this wisdom, this deep knowledge that is accessible. If we can only stop, look, and listen long enough to access it, to appreciate it, to see it. The scriptures, the teachings, the words are to help us along that way. And the practice is to put what wisdom we can glean out into the world and make use of it. So I think I'll stop there. I've, talked about, I guess, my current reading of this part of the text. And I must say, I've been acquainted with this text for a long time. And every time I read it differently. So I'd be interested in any thoughts that come to mind when you read or hear this text. And what does this poem mean to you? And how can we apply now, at this time, what Dogen is trying to guide us through? Thank you very much for listening. And I think we'll stop there and go into breakout rooms and I very much appreciate your listening.